Last week we covered conventions, which is the sort of rules of the English language. Now we're going to move on to a more technically complicated subject, which is craft structure. This is another topic that is also covered in the SAT English portion of the exam, and there are around 13 to 15 SAT questions around craft structure. And it is one of the harder topics to improve upon, but nevertheless, you can still obviously improve and practice. And craft structure is centered around vocabulary and reading. Um, More specifically, reading comprehension. So, being able to understand the paragraph that you're reading for your question, being able to translate it and understand it in your own words. And then also, vocabulary is quite critical as the more complicated questions will include um, harder and harder vocabulary. So, I'm going to link something in the chat, which I think everyone should do. You don't have to do all of it. It is simply a resource to help you with craft structure and, in general, the SAT language. But let me just link that down below. I'm going to send it in the chat, and everyone can review it in your own time. So, this is the first question. This is a beginner question. So the following text is from Srimati Swarna Kumari Devi's 1894 novel, The Fatal Garland, translated by A. Christina Albers in 1910. Shakti is walking near a riverbank that she visited frequently during her childhood. She crossed the woods she knew so well. The trees seemed to extend their branches like welcoming arms. They greeted her as an old friend. Soon she reached the riverside. Which choice best describes the function of the underlined portion in the text as a whole? Once again, same protocol as last week. If you would like to answer this question, just type your answer in the chat. And yes, C is correct. Basically, let us go through the answer choices and I'll eliminate them one by one, which is something that is actually very critical for SAT exams, since for the multiple choice sections, actually pretty much the entire English section is multiple choice. This is one very critical tip, one very important tip, is that if you do not know the answer immediately, if you're looking through your answer choices and you're struggling to find an answer that may seem right, you should always use process of elimination, which is go through each answer choice and analyze it, figure out why it does not make sense, and then cross it off. Do not look at that answer choice and move on. That way, you can reduce the amount of answer choices there are and you can select it. And another very trend that happens during SAT exams is that usually two answer choices are completely wrong. They don't have much of anything to do with the question. So those ones can be instantly eliminated and they can be crossed off, don't need to be looked at again. However, the other two answer choices, one of them is right and one of them is almost right. So that is the hardest part of process of elimination, is that one of those answer choices in those four answer choices is a trick. It's something that you can look at and you'll be like, oh, this seems right. But when you look at it deeper, it may not be like that. So let's actually look at these and we'll be able to see that trend where two of them are completely wrong, one of them is almost right, and one of them is the right answer. Obviously, which choice best describes the function of the underlined portion in the text as a whole? So obviously, let's read the underlined portion. The trees seem to extend their branches like welcoming arms. A. It suggests that Shakti feels uncomfortable near the river. So overall, that text seems to that is almost like she feels it's like not it's disturbing, not good. But if we look at the way the text is framed, this is something called I know I'm giving a lot of rules out to you right now, but bear with me. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. Something known as connotation. That's pretty much the tone and the emotion, the feeling of the text, whether it's positive or negative. Those are the two general emotions we like to use. So if we read over this text, she crossed the woods she knew so well. The trees seemed to extend their branches like welcoming arms. They greeted her as an old friend. That does not seem some sort of sad, mad, or some sort of negative emotion or feeling. This seems very positive. So A does not make sense really that much because A is like Shakti feels uncomfortable. But if you look at it, she crossed the woods she knew so well, they greeted her as an old friend. A person does not usually feel uncomfortable in that kind of situation. So A does not make sense since there's no mentioning that she feels uncomfortable or any sort of negative emotion. It indicates that Shakti has lost her sense of direction in the woods. Now, this has once again nothing to do with the question, right? She crossed the woods she knew so well. The trees seemed to extend their branches like welcoming arms. They greeted her as an old friend. Nowhere in this sentence does it mention that she feels like she has lost her sense of direction in the woods. In fact, the only mention of it is she crossed the woods she knew so well, which implies that she does have a very good sense of direction. She knows where she is. So B is one of those answer choices that is completely wrong, A and B. So now we have to look at C and D. If we look at D, right, this is the trick answer choice. I'll just give that to you up front. It conveys Shakti's appreciation for her long-term friendships. It does say in this phrase that they greeted her as an old friend. The trees greeted her as an old friend. But no, and you may see that and be like, oh, this is a long-term friendship, and she surely appreciates that. She doesn't really say though that she appreciates it. You know, she crossed the woods she knew so well. The trees they greeted her as an old friend. It never says anything about Shakti, greeting the trees or anything like that. But the tonality is positive, and for D, it also is positive, so it seems to make sense. But C, if we look at C now, it emphasizes Shakti's sense of belonging in the landscape, which makes perfect sense. She crossed the woods she knew so well. The trees seem to extend their branches. They greeted her as an old friend. So she knows the woods very well. And the woods are a landscape. That's another thing, is that the trees aren't actually people. You can't really have a friendship with the trees. So that's where D doesn't really make that sense. But C does. Because obviously landscape and they're very welcoming and she belongs there. She feels like she does because the trees seem to welcome her into the landscape. So sorry about that. That was a bit long, but I just wanted to give an introduction to craft structure. So let's move on. The following text is adapted from Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1837 story, Dr. Heidegger's Experiment. The main character, a physician, is experimenting with rehydrating a dried flower. At first, the rose lay lightly on the surface of the fluid, appearing to imbibe none of its moisture. Soon, however, a singular change began to be visible. The crushed and dried petals stirred and assumed a deepening tinge of crimson, as if the flower were reviving from a death-like slumber. So once again, same protocol. Anyone who wants to answer the question believes their answer is right. Go ahead and type it in the chat. Yes. To whoever answered in the chat, A is correct. So once again, we'll apply those same rules, process of elimination, and obviously understanding the emotion, the tone of the sentence, and being able to understand the feeling of the sentence, whether it is positive or negative. So let's read through it. At first, the rose lay lightly on the surface of the fluid, appearing to imbibe none of its moisture. So, to anyone who does not know what imbibe means, it means to absorb, essentially, to adopt, to absorb. So, essentially, what they are saying in the sentence is appearing to absorb none of the moisture of the fluid that the rose is laying on. So, that's why vocabulary is critical for craft structure. It's quite useful. And let's look at it. So soon, however, a singular change began to be visible. So the thing is, this phrase is quite small. So a rule that you would usually impose is to always look left and look right in general, which is so essentially we want to look towards the beginning of the sentence and possibly the sentence before, and towards the end of the sentence after the phrase, and possibly the sentence after that. So that will give us the tone and the context that we need in order to be able to understand it. Remember, reading comprehension, putting things in your own words. So if we look at our answer choices and we look at what they're asking, what does the phrase a singular most nearly mean? The thing is, this is where the reading comprehension is quite critical, because a singular does not mean necessarily its definition as a word by itself. It means something else when it is essentially blended in with the rest of the text. So that's why vocabulary, along with reading comprehension, is critical. So if we take a look, let's take a look at our answer choices. B, a disagreeable. Nothing in the sentence says anything about it. That is a negative connotation, right? Disagreeable does not create good feelings, right? So it does not make much of a sense because everything in this is positive. The rose began to bloom, its petals began to turn red, and the flower was reviving itself. You know, those are all positive and good things, not bad things. And nowhere does it say that this is not accepted, this change. So that's B is discarded. That's one of the completely wrong answer choices. C, an acceptable, right? If we take a look at that, once again, it does match the tone, the feeling, the emotion, right? Where it's positive, right? And acceptable is also, you could say, positive, right? It's not negative like disagreeable. But nowhere does it say that it's accepted or not accepted. So once again, C is also one of those answer choices that does not make sense. So now we're left with A and D. Now, D may make sense in terms of the context of the text, right? What the text is essentially saying, right? At first, the rose lay lightly on the surface of the fluid, and then like nowhere does it say it's an extraordinary change, but it does make sense that it's an extraordinary change, since they say it assumed a deepening tinge of crimson as if the flower were reviving from a death-like slumber. That seems quite dramatic, quite extraordinary for the flower to do such a thing. So that may seem right in terms of if you simply take only the reading comprehension, what you're able to figure out from the text around the phrase. But remember, a singular means, right, a single thing, just very single. So nothing else around it. And if we look at a lonely, that makes some sense as well, right? Because a singular most nearly means a lonely in this case, right? Because if we look at it, they're only describing one thing, and it's like sudden. It's not really expected, you know? So it's a bit confusing, but we have to take both the reading comprehension and the vocabulary, and we combine both of those. And in this case, obviously, right, if you combine both of those, you get a lonely, because the text is also describing like a lonely change began to be visible, you know, like a very extraordinary lonely change. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Also, feel free to email me if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask after the session. To people who weren't here last week, I will link my email down below. So if anyone would like to send any questions my way, I will respond to them within the day. Okay, so let us keep going. And obviously the correct answer choice is A. This is a bit harder. It's difficulty level 2. The other one was it was a mix of difficulty level 1 and 2. We won't go over difficulty level 3 today, which is the hardest. That's the way these questions are categorized. We'll do that some other time as we begin to go over craft structure more and begin building and building up. So let's read over this. Archaeological excavation of Market Street, Chinatown, a 19th century Chinese American community in San Jose, California, provided the first evidence that Asian food products were imported to the United States in 1800s. Bones from a freshwater fish species native to Southeast Asia. Jinshanshuang. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. You don't need to necessarily get everything right. Hong Kong-based import-export firms likely coordinated the fish transport from Chinese-operated fisheries in Vietnam and Malaysia to North American markets. This route reveals the often overlooked multinational dimensions of the trade networks linking Chinese diaspora communities. So one thing to do also is never skip over anything that's in parentheses. It could be useful to the context, to what you can discern, you could say, what you can get from the text. So which choice best describes the function of the underlined sentence in the text as a whole? You'll see a lot of craft structure questions actually follow that kind of saying, which choice best describes the function of the underlined sentence. So Hilda, you were actually quite close, but the answer choice is actually B. See, it gets a bit more complicated as the answer choices can sometimes also become quite lengthy and quite annoying to be able to figure out what they're saying. So sometimes you'll have to also apply that reading comprehension, putting it in your own words to the answer choices. Yeah. So let's take a look. So which choice best describes the function of the underlined sentence in the text as a whole? So let's take a look at A. It explains why efforts to determine the country of the origin of the items mentioned in the previous sentence remain inconclusive. So nowhere does it say that the country of origin of the items mentioned, which is the Asian food products and the fishes, really they don't remain inconclusive. They say directly that they're from Chinese operated fisheries in Vietnam and Malaysia. So they do say likely, but it doesn't really remain inconclusive, and it's not really the main focus of it. So it doesn't really make much sense. So we discard A. Now let's take a look at C. It traces the steps that were taken to locate and recover the objects that are described in the previous sentence. So there were no steps taken necessarily in the sentence. It just says that Hong Kong-based firm likely coordinated the fish's transport from those Chinese-operated fisheries to these North American markets. They don't say anything about the steps that were taken to recover or locate the fish or anything like that. They just say that the firm was probably responsible for it. So C does not make much sense. Now let's take a look at D. It outlines a hypothesis that additional evidence discussed in the following sentences casts some doubt on. So technically, yes, there is somewhat of a hypothesis, right? But it's not in the sentence. You see, the sentence is the evidence, right? Look, so if we were to look at this text as a whole in order to discern where the hypothesis is, it doesn't really make much sense, even if you try to take a look at it. I mean, I guess the hypothesis is that, Jin Shang Huang, the Chinese, the Hong Kong firm, obviously coordinated the fish's transport. If you were to consider that the hypothesis, there's no additional evidence. Nowhere else does it say anything about that. And if we were to say, and there's nothing else really, there is no other hypothesis or claim necessarily, because they directly introduce us to the evidence, which is that the archaeological excavation showed us that Asian food products were imported to the United States in the 1800s. Right? They go straight to the evidence, technically. So there's not really much of a hypothesis. When I did this question, I thought so that there might be a hypothesis, that Asian food products were imported to the United States in the 1800s. Maybe that's the hypothesis, but they go straight to the evidence, so it doesn't make much sense. If anyone has any questions, remember, feel free to ask. And as for B, it provides information that helps support a claim about a discovery's significance that is presented in the following sentence. Right? Okay, so information. Yes, there is information. They're talking about this Hong Kong-based import and export firm. Help support a claim about a discovery's significance, right? That is presented in the following sentence. And if we look at the following sentence, it says This route reveals the often overlooked multinational dimensions of the trade network linking Chinese diaspora communities. So that's the claim about the discovery significance, because remember, they say often overlooked, right? Multinational dimensions that are often overlooked. So about supports a claim about the discovery significance. So the discovery has some significance, and that is obviously in the following sentence, the sentence after the sentence that is highlighted. So that makes the most sense. The reason why I had originally looked at D and actually chosen D was because I hadn't read D yet. So remember to always go through all of your answer choices. Never ever lock down on anything until you have confidently eliminated all the other answer choices. So let's go here. So economist Marco Castillo and colleagues showed that nuisance costs, the time and effort people must spend to make donations, reduce charitable giving. Charities can mitigate this effect by compensating donors for nuisance costs, but those costs, though variable, are largely donation size. So charities that compensate donors will likely favor attracting a few large donors over many small donors. Now, this is a particularly hard question. And we'll actually stop with this one for today since we are at 1:30 p.m. My time at least, so we're halfway through the lesson. The answer choice is C, independent of. But once again, let's just read over the text, be able to translate it, and also look at all the answer choices. So, economist Marco Castillo and colleagues showed that nuisance costs, the time and effort people must spend to make donations, reduce charitable giving. Now, if we look at that, you may notice that there are two hyphens. Those essentially act as two commas, which is a grammatical rule that you can essentially eliminate it. It's not essential for the sentence. And if we were to eliminate it, economist Marco Castillo and colleagues showed that nuisance costs reduce charitable giving. It does make sense as a sentence, but remember, everything that is in that text, no matter if it's in double commas, if it's in quotes, if it's in parentheses, if it's in two hyphens, no matter what, always makes sense to read it because that will help you be able to understand better for your answer choices. It's the difference between the right answer choice and the wrong answer choice. So let's take a look. Let's look left and let's look right, like we said. Charities can mitigate this effect by compensating donors for nuisance costs, but those costs, though variable, are largely donation size. So that's to the left. And now let's take a look to the right. So charities that compensate donors will likely favor attracting a few large donors over many small donors. So let's take a look. Let's go for A. Supplemental to are largely added to donation size. That doesn't make much sense. Added to, joined to, that's what supplemental means. And once again, that's where that vocabulary is quite critical, very useful. So supplemental to doesn't really make that much sense. Additive, joined, but those costs, though variable, are largely added to donation size. So charities that compensate donors will likely favor attracting a few large donors. That doesn't make much sense, right? The costs aren't compensated for, right? If we look at what it's saying, it's kind of like, they aren't really useful, right? So charities that compensate donors will likely favor attracting a few large donors over many small donors, right? It basically means that charities don't want to really donate nuisance costs to people, right? Since obviously, if there are many small donors, they'll have to pay more nuisance costs. So charities, it kind of shows that charities are somewhat fine without paying these nuisance costs. And that's mainly through, but those costs are largely donation size, right? They say but, so you know that there's a change, right? They can mitigate it, but they won't really do it. So that gives you kind of a clue as to what should go in that blank space. So let's go to B, predictive of. So charities can mitigate this effect by compensating donors for nuisance costs, but those costs, though variable, are largely predictive of donor size. And that makes just zero sense in this sentence because Nuisance costs don't predict donation size. They are variable, but they don't predict it. Literally they say that the nuisance costs are essentially dependent on donation size because remember, though variable, right? So they're not reliant necessarily on donation size at all. So predictive of or anything like that does not make any sense. Now let's take a look at D, subsumed in, which is essentially a part of. So yeah, subsumed essentially means a part of, joined, included, right? Kind of like imbibe in terms of absorb, right? Included, it's a part of it. So if we take a look at that, right, charities can mitigate this effect by compensating donors for nuisance costs. But those costs, though variable, are largely subsumed in donation size, right? They're a part of their donation size. And they're not really, because, you know, nuisance costs are separate from what the donation size is. Remember, right? They're separate things. They're not dependent on each other, which we proved with predictive of, right? So though variable, so compensating donors for nuisance costs, they don't do it already. So they're separate things, and the way that they show it in this sentence or this text. So let's take a look at C, independent of. Charities can mitigate this effect by compensating donors for nuisance costs. But those costs, though variable, are largely independent of donation size. So charities that compensate donors will likely favor attracting a few large donors over many small donors. That actually makes sense, right? They are largely independent of donation size. So even if they donate a lot of money, maybe millions of dollars, or they donate $10, the nuisance costs are independent of it. Remember, because it makes sense, right? Are largely independent of donation size, and if we track a bit, we see though variable. So they're trying to prove a point that they're different, you know. So that makes sense. Even though the costs are variable, they're independent of donation size. They're not a part of it, like subsumed in, or they're not predicted by it, like predictive of, right? And then also, if we look to the right of it, to the right of our phrase, we see so charities that compensate donors will likely favor attracting a few large donors over many small donors, which makes sense once again because it's independent of donation size. You would prefer paying fewer nuisance costs for a smaller number of people that donate a lot versus paying more nuisance costs because there's more people that are donating less. So it logically makes sense as well. So C makes the most sense.